The veil was particularly agitated that morning, rippling with the colors of a bruised plum and iridescent gasoline across the upper atmosphere of the planet. It cast a shifting, uneasy light over the floating archipelagos of Starhaven Academy, making the white stone spires of the administration buildings look as though they were breathing. Dean Reth smoothed the front of his tunic with two of his upper hands, while the lower two frantically organized the holographic data slates hovering before him. Being a cephalon, a species known for their slick obsidian skin and an abundance of limbs, made him naturally suited for administration. But even he felt the strain of orientation day. He blinked his 5 eyes in a rippling sequence, a nervous tic he had been trying to suppress for 40 years. 73% attendance confirmed, Reth muttered to himself, the translator implant at his collar buzzing softly. The Ganymede shuttle is late again, and I have reports that a Hydron student has already dissolved his roommate's luggage. Wonderful. The Grand Plaza, a sprawling expanse of levitating marble connected by bridges of solid light, was a chaotic mosaic of the galaxy's youth. There were silicon-based lifeforms clinking like wind chimes as they walked, gaseous entities contained within ornate brass suits, and of course the humans. Starhaven Academy was the premier institution for training wardens, the guardians of the Veil, and it attracted the elite, the gifted, and the desperate from 1,000 systems. Reth watched a parent from the Vilos sector, a towering creature of bark and bioluminescence arguing with a baggage drone. The drone was trying to explain that live carnivorous plants were considered contraband in the dormitories. The Vilos parent was arguing that the plant was an emotional support fern. Dean Reth, a smooth, melodic voice purred from behind him. Reth spun around, nearly dropping a slate. Standing there, radiating an aura of absolute command, was Headmaster Nixari. She was Falari, a species that resembled the predatory felines of Earth mythology, but evolved into a bipedal, elegant, and deadly sentient race. Her fur was the color of midnight sleek and groomed to perfection, and her golden eyes held vertical pupils that seemed to dissect Reth's soul. She wore the deep indigo robes of her office, the silver embroidery shimmering like captured starlight. "Headmaster!" Reth bowed his many limbs, tucking in respectfully. "The preparations are 95% complete. We are just waiting for the final transport from the Terran sector." Nixari's ears twitched, swiveling toward the landing pad suspended at the edge of the plaza. "Humans," she said the word, rolling off her tongue with a mixture of amusement and wariness. "They are always so loud, even when they try to be quiet. Keep a close eye on them, Reth. The Veil reacts to their emotional volatility." "Of course, Headmaster." A deep, resonant boom echoed across the plaza, silencing the chatter of 300 students and their guardians. The Terran transport had arrived. It was not the sleek, silence-optimized vessels of the Eldar races. It was a blocky, utilitarian chunk of gray metal that relied on chemical thrust and brute force. It descended toward Docking Bay 4, with the grace of a falling brick, its landing gear deploying with a mechanical scream that made a nearby crystalline parent vibrate in distress. Steam hissed from the vents as the ramp lowered. Reth sighed, preparing his welcoming smile, or at least the facial contortion that humans interpreted as a smile. A few human families trickled out first. They looked normal enough, nervous teenagers clutching data pads, parents fussing over collars and jackets. But then, the rhythm of the disembarking crowd broke. Thud, thud, thud. It was a heavy, metallic cadence, the sound of immense weight meeting stone. The crowd at the base of the ramp parted like water hitting a rock. A figure emerged from the steam. He was massive, not because of biological bulk, but because he was encased in armor. And not the ceremonial polished armor of the Royal Guard, nor the sleek kinetic barrier suits worn by modern security forces. This was an ancient warplate. It was a monstrosity of dull gray metal, pitted and scarred. There were deep gouges across the chest plate that looked like they had been made by the claws of a leviathan. One shoulder pauldron was scorched black, the paint long since burned away by plasma fire. The hydraulic servos at the joints hissed and whined with every step, a mechanical breathing that overlaid the silence of the plaza. Walking beside this walking tank was a teenage girl. She looked to be about 16 with messy brown hair tied back in a hasty ponytail. She wore a simple denim jacket, black jeans, and a backpack that looked like it had been purchased at a discount store. Her face was a brilliant shade of crimson, and she was staring resolutely at her sneakers, wishing quite clearly that the ground would open up and swallow her whole. "Oh, by the moons," Reth whispered. "Is that a siege unit?" The armored figure stopped at the bottom of the ramp. The helmet was a solid bucket of steel, with a single horizontal slit for vision, glowing with a faint, dying amber light. The figure turned its head, the servos whining, scanning the terrified crowd. A young cephalopod student near the front let out a high-pitched squeak and discharged a cloud of defensive ink. A security drone hovered closer, its threat sensors flashing red. "Dad!" the girl hissed, her voice tight. "You promised! You said you would be low profile." The armored giant looked down at her. His voice, when it came, was processed through a vocalizer that sounded like gravel grinding together in a mixer. "This is low-profile Mira. I did not bring the heavy ordnance cannon. You are wearing a tank, Dad." To a school orientation, Reth felt a hand on his shoulder. Nixari pushed past him. Her claws slightly extended, her tail lashing behind her. "Handle the crowd, Reth," she ordered, her voice devoid of its usual purr. "I will handle the intruder." Reth scrambled to the public address system. "Attention, esteemed guests. Please remain calm. This is merely a cultural demonstration of Terran metallurgy. Please proceed to the refreshment stations for nitrogen ice cocktails." Nixari strode across the plaza, her footsteps silent, a predator stalking prey. She stopped 3 meters from the armored man. She had to crane her neck to look at the faceplate. "Sir," Nixari said, her voice projecting clearly across the silent square. "Starhaven Academy has a strict zero-tolerance policy regarding weapons of mass destruction, siege engines, and Class A combat armor on campus grounds." The armored man looked at her. He did not move. The silence stretched for 10 seconds. "I am not carrying weapons," the man said. The gravelly voice boomed without shouting. "I am dropping my daughter off for school. This is my attire." "Attire?" Nixari's whiskers twitched. "You are wearing a Mark IV Voidbreaker chassis. That suit is technically classified as a mobile fortress under intergalactic law. I must insist you power down and submit to a scan, or I will be forced to have security remove you." Mira, the daughter, covered her face with her hands. "I am so sorry," she mumbled to Nixari. He has attachment issues." "I have safety concerns," the father corrected. Nixari narrowed her eyes. "Remove the helmet, now. I need to verify that there is actually a biological entity inside that shell and not a rogue AI." The man hesitated. He looked at Mira. She peeked through her fingers and gave him a look that could have melted the armor plating. "Fine," the man grunted. He reached up. There was a hiss of depressurization, followed by the heavy clank hiss of locking mechanisms disengaging. He lifted the heavy helmet off his head. Underneath was the face of a human man, perhaps in his late 40s or early 50s, though it was hard to tell with humans. They aged so inconsistently. He had a square jaw, graying hair, cut aggressively short, and eyes the color of steel. But what drew the eye were the scars. They weren't just jagged lines of healed tissue. They were faint, geometric patterns etched into his skin, running from his neck up to his temple, glowing with a barely perceptible pale blue light. They looked like runes, ancient and faded. Reth, watching from a safe distance, felt a shiver run down his spine. He had seen markings like that in history archives, usually associated with the Great Collapse. Nixari froze. Her golden eyes widened, the pupils dilating, until her eyes were almost entirely black. Her tail stopped moving. Then, to the absolute shock of everyone present, including Dean Reth, the students, and the security drones, the proud regal headmaster of Starhaven Academy, did something unthinkable. She bowed. It was not a polite nod. It was a deep, formal bow, her hands crossed over her chest, her forehead nearly touching her knees. It was the Katara, the bow of the dead eternal. A gesture Falari reserved only for their highest monarchs, or saviors of their bloodline. A hush fell over the plaza, heavier than before. Even the wind seemed to stop. "Headmaster!" Reth squeaked. Nixari remained bowed for 3 long seconds. When she straightened up, her face was a mask of perfect composure, though Reth could see the fur along her spine was standing on end. She looked at the man who was holding his helmet under one arm, looking mildly annoyed by the attention. "Forgive me," Nixari said, her voice trembling slightly, before she smoothed it out. She turned to the crowd, raising her voice. "This man is an old friend of Starhaven. His attire, while unorthodox, is permitted as a ceremonial exemption." "Ceremonial?" Mira whispered, looking at her dad. "Since when are you ceremonial?" "Since about 5 seconds ago, apparently," Edward muttered out of the corner of his mouth. Nixari stepped closer to him, her voice dropping to a whisper that only Edward and perhaps Mira could hear. "You did not tell us you were coming." "I didn't want a parade," Edward replied flatly. "I just want to get her settled in. That is it." "There are no secrets from the Veil, Edward," Nixari said cryptically. Then she clapped her hands, shattering the tension. "Dean Reth, please direct the new students to the orientation hall. We are behind schedule by 7 minutes." Reth jolted into action. Yes, right this way. Everyone please follow the floating lights. Do not touch the spectral jellyfish, they sting." The crowd began to move, the buzz of conversation returning with double the intensity. The students were whispering furiously, pointing at the man in the armor. "Did you see the headmaster bow? My dad says that armor is from the Unification Wars. I heard he's a mercenary. I heard he's a war criminal." Edward ignored them all. He walked beside Mira, his unhelmeted head high, his expression stony. "You know," Mira said, adjusting her backpack straps, "when I said I wanted to be normal, this isn't what I had in mind." "Headmaster Nixari bowed to you, Dad." "Why did she bow?" "She's polite," Edward said. "It is a cat thing." "It was a deep bow, Dad. She looked like she was worshipping you." "She was checking my boots for mud. Standard protocol." Mira rolled her eyes so hard it looked painful. "You are impossible. Can you at least try to blend in, please?" "I am blending," Edward said. He took a step, and his metal boot crushed a loose paving stone into dust with a sound like a gunshot. "Oops." They stopped near the edge of the central fountain. Mira sighed and looked down. "My lace is untied." "Hold on," Edward said. Before Mira could stop him, Edward dropped to one knee. The motion was heavy, the servos groaning under the strain of the plates. His massive gauntleted hand, capable of crushing a tank tread, reached out with surprising delicacy. The fingers of the armor were articulated with incredible precision. He pinched the flimsy fabric of her sneaker lace. As his knee hit the ground, the metal greave made direct contact with the ancient white stone of the plaza. Reth, who was herding a group of gelatinous students nearby, was the only one watching closely enough to see it. Where the metal of Edward's armor touched the stone, a pulse of light rippled outward. It wasn't a reflection. It came from inside the rock. The faint, dormant ley lines that ran through the floating island flared to life, a bright, happy azure, tracing a complex geometric pattern that spiraled out from Edward's knee before fading away, as if soothingly patted on the head. The stone purred. It was a low vibration felt in the teeth, rather than heard. Reth stared. The architecture of Starhaven was semi-sentient, woven with magic to keep the islands afloat. It was notoriously temperamental. It had never reacted to a parent like a dog greeting its master. Edward finished tying the knot a perfect double loop and stood up. The light in the stone vanished instantly. "There," Edward said. Secure. Thanks. Mira mumbled, her face softening just a fraction. Come on. The tour is starting. They joined the group. Reth shook his head, his eyes blinking rapidly. Just a soldier, he told himself. Just a very heavy old soldier. But his intuition, honed by decades of dealing with chaotic, magical teenagers, told him that was a lie. The campus tour was an exercise in organized wonder. The group, led by a chirpy third-year student named Kale, a being with crystalline wings, moved through the floating gardens where gravity was only 50% of standard. They walked past the dormitories of the elements, which shifted their internal layout based on the occupants' needs. They stopped at the Bridge of Sighs, a glass walkway that offered a direct view of the Veil above. The Veil, Kale explained, gesturing dramatically to the swirling barrier in the sky. The boundary between our reality and the ether. It is the source of all magic and the source of all danger. Our job as future wardens is to monitor it, to stitch it when it tears, and to ensure that what lies beyond stays beyond. Mira looked up at the veil. Reflected in her eyes, the barrier looked beautiful and terrifying. It's closer than I thought, she whispered. Edward stood at the back of the group. He didn't look up. He was watching the shadows between the buildings, his hand hovering near his hip, where a weapon would have been had he brought one. Dad, look, Mira said, nudging him. The veil. Edward glanced up for a fraction of a second. It's purple today, he grunted. High ionization. Means a storm is coming next week. The guide said the colors represent the mood of the universe, Mira corrected him. The universe's mood is usually angry, Edward replied, or hungry. They moved on to the lecture hall for the parent and guardian orientation. It was a massive amphitheater, carved into the side of the central peak, open to the air, but shielded by a shimmering force field. The seats were designed for various anatomies, but none were designed for a man wearing 400 pounds of plasteel and ceramic plating. Edward found a bench near the back, reinforcing the stone with a hand before slowly lowering himself. The bench groaned in protest but held. Mira sat with the other students in the front rows. She was already talking to a girl with bright blue hair, Amelia, presumably, and a boy who looked like he was made of polished glass. She was smiling. She looked normal. She looked happy. Edward felt a pang in his chest that had nothing to do with the shrapnel scars under his ribs. This is it, he thought. She is safe here. I drop her off. I file the paperwork and I leave. Back to the quiet. Good morning, parents, guardians, and biological progenitors. The voice commanded attention. Standing on the central dais was a human woman. She was striking with sharp features, hair pulled back in a severe bun, and wearing the practical pocket-heavy jumpsuit of a field researcher rather than academic robes. I am Dr. Virginia Soule, she announced, professor of practical astromancy and combat logistics. You are here because your children have the gift. They can touch the veil. That makes them special. It also makes them incredibly dangerous to themselves and everyone around them. She began to pace the stage, her movements precise and energetic. Here at Starhaven, we do not just teach them to wave wands. We teach them engineering. We teach them survival. We teach them that magic is not a fairy tale. It is physics with an attitude. She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd of parents. She was assessing them, calculating. Reth, hovering near the entrance, knew that Virginia had a background in military intelligence before she turned to academia. She didn't look at parents. She looked for threats. Her gaze swept over the Vilos tree man, the gaseous cloud beings, and then stopped dead at the back row. She looked at Edward. Edward sat motionless, his helmet resting on his knee. He met her gaze. Virginia's eyes narrowed. She took in the scorched pauldron, the specific modifications to the gauntlets, the rune scars on his face. She didn't look confused like Nixari. She looked suspicious. She recognized the gear not as a relic, but as a tool. Active duty, her eyes seemed to say. Why is a siegebreaker sitting in my lecture hall, the Veil? Virginia continued forcing her eyes away from Edward, though her body remained angled slightly toward him. Is a living membrane. It reacts to stress. Lately, we have measured an increase in fluctuations. Small tears. Nothing our staff cannot handle but enough to warrant vigilance. As if on cue, a low thrumming sound vibrated through the floor of the amphitheater. It started as a buzz, shaking the dust from the stone benches. Then, the sky above them screamed. It wasn't a sound of wind. It was the sound of fabric tearing amplified 1,000 times. Every head snapped up. Above the academy, the veil, which had been a lazy swirl of purple and blue, suddenly convulsed. A jagged line of blinding white light slashed across the sky like a wound opening in flesh. "Alert!" the automated system blared. "Minor oscillation detected. Sector 7. The students gasped. Some screamed. The alien parents chattered in a dozen languages of panic. "Calm down," Virginia's voice cut through the noise amplified by a quick spell. "This is a standard microfracture. It will seal in 10 seconds. In the back row, Edward didn't panic. He didn't scream. He moved. In the time it took for the other parents to gasp, Edward was on his feet. His hand had snapped to his side, his body dropping into a combat crouch, so perfect it looked rehearsed. His eyes were not on the sky. They were scanning the perimeter of the amphitheater, looking for the fallout, looking for the leak. He gripped the stone railing in front of him. The metal gauntlet squeezed. Crack. The solid marble railing crumbled into dust under his grip. Above, the white tear in the sky hissed and vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only a fading afterimage. "See," Virginia said, her voice steady, though her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. "Gone. The Academy's suppression wards are functioning at 100% efficiency. There is no danger." The crowd exhaled a collective release of tension. Nervous laughter bubbled up. "Just a drill, probably," one parent muttered. "Quite the light show," another said. Edward slowly straightened up. He looked at his hand covered in white marble dust. He brushed it off against his leg. His heart was hammering against his ribs, not from fear, but from a reflex he hadn't used in years. That wasn't a microfracture, he thought. That was a knock. Something is testing the door. He looked up toward the stage. Dr. Virginia Saul was not looking at the sky. She was looking directly at him. She was looking at the pile of pulverized marble dust at his feet, and then at his face. She didn't look reassured. She looked like a scientist who had just discovered a new volatile element in her laboratory. Her expression was a mix of intense curiosity and profound distrust. Edward held her gaze. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He simply nodded a tiny, almost imperceptible acknowledgement of her scrutiny. "She knows," Edward realized. "She doesn't know who I am, but she knows what I am." Reth, watching from the shadows, felt a headache blooming behind his third eye. The orientation was technically over, but as he watched the silent electric stare-down between the professor of combat logistics and the man in the ancient battle armor, he knew the real trouble was just beginning. The veil had cracked, and something told Reth that the man in the back row was the only one who had heard what whispered through the gap. The lecture hall air was cool and smelled faintly of ozone and old parchment, a scent that seemed to be pumped in through the vents to encourage academic seriousness. Dr. Virginia Saul stood at the center of the dais, a holographic projection of the veil, rotating slowly above her head. It was a jagged, beautiful map of the local reality tiers, rendered in angry reds and soothing blues. "The veil is not a wall," Virginia said, her voice projecting to the back of the room without the aid of a microphone. "It is a membrane. Think of it less like stone and more like skin. It breathes, it sweats, and occasionally it bleeds. Our job, and the job your children are training for, is to be the immune system." She tapped a console, and the hologram zoomed in on a specific sector of the barrier. "Current readings indicate a stability variance of 4%, she continued. "This is within the safety margins, but it requires constant monitoring. The resonant frequency of the barrier typically sits at 14.2 gigahertz. If it drops below 12, we initiate containment protocols. That is assuming a static emotional baseline, a gravelly voice interrupted from the back row. Virginia stopped. The hologram froze. She looked up, squinting past the glare of the stage lights to the shadowed bench where the armored man sat. Edward had not removed the rest of his suit. He sat like a boulder in a stream, the other parents giving him a wide berth of at least 3 feet on either side. "Excuse me," Virginia asked, her tone sharp. "The frequency," Edward said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "You are calculating based on background radiation, but the veil reacts to sentient distress. If you have 300 nervous teenagers on campus for orientation, that baseline frequency is not 14.2. It is likely closer to 13.8, which means your safety margin is not 4%. It is less than 1%. A murmur rippled through the crowd. A parent resembling a large, sentient mushroom leaned away from Edward, looking scandalized. Virginia stared at him. Her mind raced through the calculations. He was right. It was an adjustment usually reserved for advanced theoretical astromancy, not something a parent would know. "You seem very knowledgeable about etheric physics, mister." She trailed off, waiting for a name. "Just a concerned parent," Edward replied, leaning back against the groaning stone bench. "And you should check the thermal stress on the northern quadrant anchors. They tend to overheat when the freshman class starts practicing pyromancy." Virginia narrowed her eyes. "The anchors are self-regulating." "They were designed to be," Edward corrected. "But the cooling vents get clogged with sulfur deposits every 10 years. It has been exactly 10 years since the last maintenance cycle." The silence in the hall was thick enough to cut with a knife. Virginia looked at her datapad quickly, pulling up the maintenance logs. Her eyes widened slightly. The northern anchors were indeed flagged for inspection due to heat warnings. "I will make a note of that," she said, her voice stiff. "Thank you for the input." She turned back to the lecture, but her rhythm was broken. She found her eyes drifting back to the man in the iron shell. He was not just a soldier. Soldiers knew how to shoot. They did not know the thermal decay rates of magical anchors or the psycho-reactive properties of the veil. Who was he, outside the lecture hall? Dean Reth was having a panic attack, though he made it look like efficient multitasking. He walked briskly down the corridor of echoes, his forearms clutching various datapads and stress-relief squishy toys. "Dean Reth." The voice came from the shadows of a decorative archway. Reth jumped, dropping a blue squishy toy shaped like a moonslug. Headmaster Nixari stepped out, her tail twitching with controlled agitation. "Headmaster!" Reth gasped, scrambling to pick up the toy. "I was just going to check on the catering. The amorphous parents require their nutrient paste at exactly room temperature." "Forget the paste," Nixari said, falling into step beside him. Her movements were fluid, making no sound on the polished floor. "I have a new priority for you. The human, Edward." "The tank?" Reth asked. "I mean the gentleman in the heavy attire." "Him," Nixari confirmed. "I want you to watch him. Do not be obvious. Do not antagonize him. But I need to know where he is and what he is doing at every moment he is on my campus." Reth swallowed hard. "With all due respect, Headmaster, that man looks like he could dismantle me with a glance. Why is he here? And why, forgive me for asking, why did you bow to him?" Nixari stopped. She turned her golden gaze on Reth, and for a moment he felt like a mouse caught in the open. "I bowed," Nixari said softly, "because protocol demands it. And because if I had not, the wards in the floor might have recognized him and tried to sing him a welcome song, which would have been far harder to explain." "The wards," Reth blinked, his 5 eyes in confusion. "Does the castle know him?" "The castle remembers what built it," Nixari said enigmatically. She resumed walking. "He says he is just a father. Let us hope that is true. Because if the warden has returned to active duty, It means the world is in far more danger than a simple orientation day suggests. Go, Reth. Be his shadow. Reth watched her leave. He felt a cold knot form in his stomachs. He had read the old stories. The wardens were myths figures of immense power who stood between the world and the void. They were supposed to be extinct or ascended or simply gone. They were not supposed to be middle-aged men who argued about thermal vents. In the dormitory of the Four Winds, Mira was trying to explain her life choices to a room full of strangers. The room was circular with gravity plates that allowed each student to orient their bed on the walls or ceiling as they preferred. Mira had chosen a standard floor placement. Her roommate Amelia, a human girl with hair dyed a violent shade of electric blue, was unpacking a suitcase that seemed to be bigger on the inside. "So," Amelia said, pulling out a poster of a popular holographic band. "Let me get this straight. Your dad is a cosplayer." Mira groaned, burying her face in her pillow. "No, he is just protective." "Protective as pepper spray," Amelia noted, sticking the poster to the wall with a slap of her hand. "Protective is a tracking chip in your phone. That guy was wearing a Siege-class Voidbreaker suit. That is not protective, Mira. That is an invasion force." On the ceiling, the third roommate Kiro was hanging upside down like a bat. Kiro was a sylphid, a humanoid with translucent, shimmering skin and wings that looked like dragonflies. "I thought it was magnificent," Kiro chirped his voice, sounding like wind chimes. "The metal sang with history. Did you see the scorch marks he has walked through fire?" "He has walked through the kitchen and burned toast," Mira mumbled. "He is just my dad. He is weird, okay? He spends all his time in the garage tinkering with old junk. He never goes out. This is the first time he has left our sector in 5 years." "Why?" Amelia asked, pausing with a handful of socks. "I do not know," Mira admitted. She sat up, hugging her knees. "He says the world is too loud. He likes the quiet. But then I got the acceptance letter to Starhaven and he changed. He got intense. He spent 3 weeks polishing that armor. He said he had to make sure the seals were tight." "Maybe he thinks the school is dangerous," Kiro suggested, dropping down from the ceiling to hover in the center of the room. "It is a school," Amelia scoffed. "The most dangerous thing here is the cafeteria food. My brother said the meatloaf tries to crawl away." Mira forced a laugh, but inside she felt a twist of guilt. She wanted to be angry at him. She wanted to be mortified that he had stomped into her new life like a metallic dinosaur. But she remembered the look on his face when they boarded the transport. He had been shaking, not with fear, but with vigilance. His eyes had been scanning every shadow, every face, as if he expected an assassin behind every vending machine. He was terrified for her, and that made her love him and resent him in equal measure. She wanted to be a warden. She wanted to face the darkness. How could she do that if her father insisted on being her personal shield? "I just want him to go home," Mira whispered. "I want him to know I can handle this." "Well," Amelia said, zipping up her suitcase, "if he keeps wearing that suit, he is going to get expelled before you do. Come on. We are supposed to meet on the training grounds for the safety demonstration. I heard Dr. Saul is going to blow something up." The training grounds were a vast, open-air plateau, floating on the edge of the archipelago. The view was dizzying. Below them lay miles of empty sky, and the swirling clouds of the planet's surface, and above them, the veil pulsated with a rhythmic, hypnotic light. 200 parents and students stood in a semicircle around a large obsidian pylon. Embedded in the top of the pylon was a resonance crystal, a diamond the size of a watermelon that hummed with a low, steady pitch. Dr. Virginia Saul stood next to the pylon, wearing protective goggles. "This crystal mimics the energy signature of a warden," she explained to the crowd. "It attracts ambient energy from the veil, so we can measure the local density. Right now it is glowing blue, which means the connection is stable." Edward, stood at the very back of the crowd, his helmet under his arm. Reth was hovering nearby, pretending to examine a shrub, while keeping all 5 eyes on the armored man. "Now," Virginia said, raising a wand, "I am going to induce a minor stress test. I will increase the pull of the crystal by 10%. You will see the light shift to green. This simulates a standard spellcasting load." She flicked the wand. A beam of light hit the crystal. The crystal did not turn green. It turned a violent, angry red. The hum became a shriek. The air pressure on the plateau dropped instantly, popping ears and making the hair on everyone's arms stand up. "Stabilizing!" Virginia shouted, waving her wand in a counter pattern. "Powering down!" It did not power down. The crystal began to vibrate so hard, the obsidian pylon cracked. "Get back!" Edward roared. His voice cut through the shrieking wind like a cannon shot. Before anyone could process the command, the crystal exploded. It did not shower them with shrapnel. Instead, it released what it had been holding. The energy of the veil condensed and pressurized, burst outward, not as a blast wave but as liquid light. Thick, ropey strands of glowing violet energy lashed out like the tentacles of a giant sea anemone. They were beautiful and terrifying, whipping through the air with a sound like cracking whips. A group of students near the front screamed as the strands wrapped around their ankles, lifting them into the air. One strand coiled around a Vilo's parent, burning the bark-like skin. Panic erupted. The crowd surged back, trampling over each other. "Containment field!" Virginia yelled, throwing her hands up. A golden dome of light shimmered into existence, but the violet strands smashed against it, shattering the magic like glass. "It is too strong. The resonance is feeding back." Edward did not run away. He did not run toward the exit. He slammed his helmet onto his head. The seals hissed shut. The amber eye slit flared to life. "Mira!" he shouted, his amplified voice booming. He saw her. She was near the pylon, frozen in shock, watching a tendril of pure energy dart toward her face like a striking cobra. Edward moved. The servos in his legs whined as he launched himself forward. He covered the 20 meters in 2 strides, moving with a speed that defied the laws of mass and momentum. He did not punch the energy. He did not fire a weapon. He stepped between Mira and the lash of light. The violet tendril struck his chest plate. There was no impact sound. Instead, the light seemed to splash against the ancient metal, sticking to it. Edward grabbed the strand of light with his gauntleted hand. "Virginia!" Edward bellowed, not looking back. "Drop the glyphs. Do not fight it. You are making it angry." "Angry!" Virginia yelled back, dodging a flailing tentacle. "It is energy. It does not have feelings." "It is the veil," Edward roared. "It has moods. Drop the barrier." Virginia hesitated for a split second, then dropped her hands. The golden dome vanished. Edward stood firm, holding the writhing snake of light. He did not crush it. He began to run his hand along the length of the energy strand, a motion that looked bizarrely gentle. He stroked the chaotic magic as if he were soothing a frightened horse. "Easy!" His voice rumbled low and rhythmic, the vocalizer filtering out the harshness. He began to chant, not a spell, but a series of hums and clicks that sounded like the language of stones, shifting deep underground. "Easy now. Return to the flow. You are not meant to be here. Go home." The violet light shuddered. The chaotic whipping stopped. The color shifted from angry violet to a soft, sleepy lavender. The strands that had grabbed the students went slack, releasing them and drifted toward Edward like curious vines. The entire crowd watched in stunned silence. The armored giant stood in the center of a grove of floating light, his hands moving in slow, hypnotic patterns, combing the tangles out of reality. "Dr. Saul," Edward said softly, not breaking his rhythm. "Now, open a vent, small aperture, vector 39. Virginia stared at him, her mouth slightly open. She shook herself, her training kicking in. She raised her wand and traced a complex sigil in the air. "Opening vent. Vector 39. A small, controlled tear opened in the air above the pylon. Edward guided the strands of light upward. They flowed like water, spiraling up his arms off his shoulders and into the vent. He guided them with a masterful practiced grace, like a conductor leading an orchestra of ghosts. With a final soft sigh, the last wisp of light vanished into the vent. Virginia sealed it shut with a sharp gesture. Silence returned to the plateau. The only sound was the heavy, mechanical breathing of Edward's suit. He stood there for a moment, his hands still raised. Then he slowly lowered them. He turned to Mira, who was sitting on the ground shaking. He knelt, the armor clanking. He opened his faceplate. "Are you hurt?" Mira shook her head, her eyes wide. "Dad, what was that?" Edward didn't answer. He looked up and found Virginia standing over him. Her jumpsuit was singed, her hair coming loose from its bun. She was looking at him with a gaze that stripped him bare. It was no longer suspicion. It was recognition, not of his face, but of his technique. "You soothed it," Virginia said, her voice breathless. "You did not banish it. You did not block it. You groomed it." Edward stood up, wincing slightly, as a joint in his knee popped. "Fighting the veil is like fighting the ocean," he muttered. "You just get drowned. You have to ask it nicely to leave." Virginia let out a short, incredulous laugh. She wiped soot from her cheek. "I have studied astromancy for 20 years. I have never seen anyone ask a raw energy singularity to please leave, and have it actually listen." "Beginner's luck," Edward said, his face impassive. "That was not luck," Virginia said, stepping closer, invading his personal space. She looked at the scorched metal of his chest plate, where the light had touched. "And that is the worst way to impress a new colleague I have ever seen. You nearly gave me a heart attack." "I was not trying to impress you," Edward said. "I was trying to keep my daughter from being turned into a glow stick." "Well," Virginia said, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. "You did both. Effective. Terrifyingly effective." Reth, watching from behind the ruin of the pylon, tapped his comms badge. "Headmaster," he whispered. "You need to see the security footage. Immediately." The headmaster's office was a sphere of glass, suspended at the highest point of the central spire. It was filled with floating cushions and intricate scratching posts made of petrified wood. Nixari sat on a high perch, looking down at the 4 people standing on the transparent floor, Edward still in armor helmet off Virginia Reth, and a very nervous Mira. "The cycle is returning," Nixari said. Her voice was heavy, lacking its usual playful lilt. "The oscillation today was not a random event. It was a symptom. The Great Weaver is waking up." Virginia stepped forward. "Headmaster, with respect, the Great Weaver is a myth. A bedtime story about the entity that lives behind the veil." "It is not a myth," Edward said. Everyone turned to him. He was standing by the window, looking out at the darkening sky. "It is a biological construct," Edward continued. "A consciousness formed from the psychic debris of a billion civilizations. It wakes up every 400 years to feed. It tears the veil to get to the biomass on this side." Virginia stared at him. "How do you know that that is classified level 10 archival data? I do not have access to that." Nixari leaped down from her perch, landing silently in front of Edward. "He knows, because he was there the last time it woke up," Mira gasped. "Dad, that is impossible. That was centuries ago." Edward looked at his daughter. The pain in his eyes was old and deep. "Time moves differently when you are bonded to the veil, Mira. I have been around a long time." Nixari placed a clawed hand on Edward's armored forearm. "Edward, the Academy needs you. The Council needs you. We cannot fight this with fresh recruits in theory. We need the Warden." Edward pulled his arm away. The metal scraped against itself. "No. No," Nixari's ears flattened. "I promised her," Edward gestured to Mira. "I promised her a normal life. I promised her I was done with the wars. I came here to drop her off. That is all." "You cannot simply leave," Virginia argued, her voice rising. "You saw what happened on the field. You are the only one who can handle the raw strands. If you leave these children, your daughter will be defenseless." "You have shields," Edward said stubbornly. "You have an army of mages. Use them." "They are not enough," Virginia stepped in front of him, forcing him to look at her. "Stop pretending to be just a janitor in a tank, Edward. You have a duty." "My duty is to my family," Edward snapped. "I am your family." Mira's voice cut through the argument. Edward froze. He looked at Mira. She was standing with her fists clenched, tears streaming down her face. "I am your family," Mira repeated, her voice shaking. "And I live here now. This is my home. If you leave, you are not protecting me. You are abandoning me to the thing you are running from." Edward opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked at Mira, really looked at her, and saw not the little girl he had carried on his shoulders, but a young woman standing on a battlefield he knew too well. "Mira," he whispered, "I just wanted you to be safe." "I am not safe," Mira said. "None of us are. But I would be safer if my dad was watching my back instead of hiding in his garage." The silence stretched agonizing and heavy. Edward looked from Mira to Virginia, who was watching him with a mixture of challenge and plea. He looked at Nixari, who waited with the patience of a sphinx. "I will not rejoin the Corps," Edward said, finally, his voice low. "I will not take orders from the Council. I am not a soldier anymore." "We do not need a soldier," Nixari said softly. "We need a consultant." Edward sighed, a sound that seemed to come from the bottom of a well. "I will stay, temporarily, until the fluctuations stabilize. Then I am gone." Mira let out a breath she had been holding. She stepped forward and hugged the cold metal of his waist. Edward hesitated, then placed his heavy hand on her head. "Go to your dorm," he told her gently. "I have to discuss logistics." Mira nodded, pulling away. She looked at Virginia, then at her dad. "Be careful," she said. Then she turned and left the office, Reth hurrying after her to escort her back. Night had fallen over Starhaven. The moons were rising, casting silver light over the floating islands. Edward stood on the balcony of the observation tower, the wind whipping at his short gray hair. He had removed the upper chest plate of his armor to perform maintenance, revealing a black undersuit and the glowing rune scars that traced down his neck and disappeared under the fabric. He was staring at the veil. In the darkness, it was a river of ghost light, swirling and churning. "You should put a coat on," a voice said. "It is freezing up here." Edward did not turn. He knew the footsteps. "The cold does not bother me. My nervous system is dampened." Virginia stepped up to the railing beside him. She held 2 steaming mugs. She offered one to him. "It is tea," she said. "Not engine oil, though I suspect you might prefer that." Edward took the mug. His hand without the gauntlet looked surprisingly human, though the knuckles were scarred and thick. "Thank you." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the cosmic light show. "I looked you up," Virginia said quietly. "Or I tried to. Your file is redacted, all of it. Even the name Edward is listed as a pseudonym." "It is a good name," Edward said, taking a sip. "Simple." "Who are you really?" Virginia asked. She turned to face him, leaning her hip against the railing. Her eyes were dark and intelligent, reflecting the starlight. "And do not tell me you are a consultant. Consultants do not know how to sing the veil to sleep." Edward swirled the tea in his mug. "There was a unit," he said slowly. "Long ago. They were called the Stitchers. Their job was not to fight the monsters. Their job was to repair the cage." "The Stitchers are a legend," Virginia said. "They all died closing the Great Rift." "Most of them died," Edward corrected. He looked at her. His eyes were the color of old iron. "One of them was left over. too stubborn to die, or maybe just unlucky. Virginia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. She looked at the scars on his face, the glowing runes. "You are him," she whispered. "The last stitcher. You are the one who locked the door." "I did what had to be done," Edward said, his voice hardening. "And it cost me everything. My friends, my humanity. I spent 2 centuries in a stasis pod healing from the radiation. When I woke up, the world had moved on. I found a wife. I had a daughter. I tried to be a man." He gripped the railing, the metal groaning under his hand. "I cannot do it again, Virginia. I cannot be the hero. I am empty. There is nothing left in me to give." Virginia reached out. She hesitated, then placed her hand over his, covering the scars on his knuckles. Her skin was warm against his cold flesh. "You are not empty," she said firmly. "I saw you today. I saw you look at Mira. I saw you look at those students. You are full of fear, Edward. And that is good. Fear means you have something to lose. The heroes in the stories are boring. They are invincible. I do not need invincible. I need someone who knows how much it hurts to bleed and fights anyway." Edward looked down at her hand. It looked so small, so fragile, covering his. He felt a strange warmth spreading up his arm, a sensation he hadn't felt in decades. It was terrifying. "Virginia," he began, his voice rough. Whoop, whoop, whoop." The alarm cut through the night like a physical blow. It was not the polite chime of the orientation. It was the deep, resonant horn of a siege alert. The sky above them tore open. This was not a fracture. It was a chasm. A hole in the sky the size of a city block, ripped open directly above the central plaza. "Level 1 breach," the automated voice screamed. "Structural integrity failing, all hands to battle stations." Edward dropped the mug. It shattered on the stone floor. "Mira," he said. "Go!" Virginia shouted, already sprinting toward the door. "I will rally the faculty. Get to the dorms." Edward didn't run. He grabbed his chest plate from the bench and slammed it against his body. The magnetic locks engaged with a heavy thud. He grabbed his helmet. As he looked at the tearing sky, the weary father vanished. The consultant vanished. The stitcher returned. He pulled the helmet on. The amber eyes flared. "Hold on, kid," the gravelly voice growled. He vaulted over the railing, plummeting toward the chaotic lights of the academy below, falling like a meteor, made of vengeance and steel. The wail of the sirens was not a sound. It was a physical pressure that vibrated in the marrow of every bone on Starhaven. Above the academy, the sky had ceased to be a sky. The veil, usually a majestic river of auroral light, had torn open like a piece of wet silk, stretched too tight. Through the jagged rent in reality, a wind was blowing, not a wind of air, but a gale of raw, unfiltered concepts. It tasted like copper and old memories. It smelled of ozone and terrifying geometry. The floating islands of the archipelago groaned. The massive chains of gravity magic that tethered them to the planet's orbit rattled, the sound echoing like thunder. "Sector 4 shields are buckling," a voice screamed over the campus intercom. "The kinetic barriers are dissolving. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill." In the center of the plaza, Headmaster Nixari stood in the eye of the hurricane. She had shed her academic robes, revealing a bodysuit of flexible midnight blue armor that allowed for the full range of Falari movement. Her hands moved in a blur, manipulating a 3-dimensional mandala of hard light that represented the Academy's defenses. "Reth," Nixari barked, her voice amplified by magic to cut through the roar of the etheric wind. "Get the first-year students to the obsidian bunkers. Do not let them stop to pack. If they try to bring their pets, leave the pets." Dean Reth was currently trying to wrestle a panic-stricken gaseous cloud student into a containment jar for transport. "I am trying, Headmaster, but the physics department is currently floating upside down." Edward landed on the plaza, with a force that cracked the paving stones. He had deployed the heavy stabilizers in his legs, turning himself into an immovable object against the gale. He stood up the servos of his Mark IV Voidbreaker armor, whining in protest against the magical pressure. "Nick, sorry," Edward shouted. "The tears are not random. It is being pulled open from the inside." Nixari looked at him, her golden eyes slitted with focus. "I know the anchor. Someone is tampering with the anchor circuit in the deep levels." "I am going down there," Edward said, checking the charge on his gauntlets. "You cannot go alone," Nixari snapped, redirecting a shield panel to deflect a falling piece of masonry. "The lower levels are a labyrinth of unstable mana. You need a guide who knows the current layout." Her eyes darted around and landed on the unfortunate Dean Reth, who had just managed to seal the jar. "Reth, you are with the Warden." "I am what?" Reth squeaked, dropping the jar. "Headmaster. I am an administrator. My combat experience is limited to breaking up fights over the last pudding cup." "Go!" Nixari roared a sound that was half woman, half jungle cat. Edward grabbed Reth by the back of his tunic. "Hold on," he grunted. "Hold on to Woh." Edward activated his jump jets. They did not blast fire. They blasted a concussive wave of force. The armored man and the flailing alien launched into the air, arcing over the panicked crowd, and diving toward the restricted service shaft that led to the island's core. As Edward and Reth descended into the dark, Virginia Saul was fighting a war on the surface. "Formation Beta!" she screamed, her wand acting as a conductor's baton for a squad of 20 senior students. "Shields up, interlocking pattern. Do not let the gaps drift." They were holding the line at the entrance to the freshman dormitories. The tear in the sky was leaking. It wasn't raining water. It was raining things. Creatures of semi-solid light were pulling themselves out of the rift. They looked like scribbles drawn by a mad child, jagged glowing lines that shifted form constantly. Wolves made of lightning. Birds made of shattered glass. They didn't have biology. They had intent. And their intent was to disassemble anything solid. "Contact front!" Kiro shouted from the air. The Sylphid student was hovering above the shield line, his dragonfly wings buzzing. He pointed a slender finger, and a bolt of compressed air slammed into a wolf creature, shattering it into harmless sparks. "Good shot, Kiro!" Virginia yelled. "Keep your elevation watch for the phase shifters." Mira was on the ground, shoulder to shoulder with Amelia. Mira held a standard-issue focusing rod, her knuckles white. "I cannot remember the incantation for the kinetic pulse," Mira yelled, panic rising in her throat. "Is it Auravex or Auravox?" "Just hit it," Amelia screamed. She swung her heavy suitcase, which she had refused to leave behind, and slammed it into a crab-like creature made of blue neon. The suitcase impacted with a solid thwack. "See, physics works too." "Physics is great," Mira panted, "until they phase through matter." A creature resembling a serpent made of smoke lunged at them, passing straight through Amelia's suitcase. Mira reacted on instinct. She didn't use a spell from the textbook. She remembered what her father had done at the orientation. She didn't try to push the creature away. She reached out with her mind and tried to find the frequency of its existence. "Calm down," she thought, projecting the feeling. "You are just static." The smoke serpent hesitated. It solidified for a fraction of a second. "Now!" Virginia shouted from down the line. Mira swung her rod. Auravex, a pulse of force, hit the solidified serpent, blasting it into mist. "I did it!" Mira yelled, shock washing over her. "Do not celebrate yet!" Virginia commanded, firing a stream of fire from her wand to incinerate a swarm of light wasps. They are regrouping. The tiers are getting wider. Deep beneath the surface, the air was heavy and tasted of copper. The walls of the anchor chamber were carved from the living bedrock of the island, inlaid with glowing silver runes that pulsed like a heartbeat. Edward marched down the corridor, his helmet light cutting through the gloom. Reth trotted behind him, wringing all four of his hands. "This area has been sealed for 50 years, Reth whispered. "The radiation levels here should be lethal. Why are we not melting?" "Because the energy is being siphoned," Edward said grimly. "Someone is drinking it." They reached the massive blast doors of the central anchor. The doors, made of a metal that no longer existed in the known universe, were open. Inside, the chamber was vast. In the center stood the anchor, a pillar of crystal the size of a skyscraper, going down into the abyss and up into the ceiling. It was the needle that pinned Starhaven to reality. But it was not alone. Surrounding the anchor were 12 figures. They wore robes of shifting gray fabric that seemed to blur into the background. They were not chanting. They were working. They had set up complex machinery resonators, dampeners, and frequency modulators, all pointed at the crystal. "Veil Seers," Reth gasped. "I thought they were a philosophy club." "They look like a demolition crew to me," Edward growled. One of the figures turned. She lowered her hood. It was a Falari like Nixari, but her fur was snow-white, and her eyes were not golden. They were entirely black, filled with tiny pinpricks of light, like a deep-field image of space. "Welcome," she said. Her voice was soft, but it echoed perfectly in the vast chamber. "I wondered when the guard dog would bark." "Step away from the anchor," Edward said his external speakers, amplifying his voice to a rumble. "You are destabilizing the entire sector." "We are unbinding it," the Falari woman corrected. "I am Seren, and you are the one they whisper about in the forbidden texts. The last Stitcher." She looked at him, not with fear, but with pity. "You look tired, Stitcher," Seren said, walking slowly toward him. The other cultists continued their work, ignoring the intruder. "Do you know how much potential you strangled when you sewed the veil shut during the Great Collapse? You locked us in a dark room and called it safety." "I saved the galaxy from being eaten," Edward said, his hand hovering near the maglock of his hip holster. "The veil is not a door to a library, Seren. It is a dam holding back a flood." "It is both," Seren countered. "The entities beyond are chaotic, yes, but they are pure information. They are the source code of the universe. By keeping them out, you have stagnated our evolution. We are just waiting to die in a crib. I am choosing to let us walk." "You are choosing to let us burn," Edward said. "Evolution is always painful," Seren smiled, revealing sharp teeth. "Initiate the harmonic spike." Behind her, the machinery hummed to a crescendo. A beam of dark energy shot from the devices striking the anchor. The crystal screamed. It was a sound like glass shattering in a cathedral. A crack appeared on the surface of the pillar. "Stop!" Reth yelled, surprising himself. "You will drop the island out of the sky. A small price," Seren said. Edward did not hesitate. He charged. 3 of the Veil Seers moved to intercept him. They were not warriors, but they wielded tools of manipulation. One threw a gravity well grenade. Edward felt his weight increase tenfold. His armor groaned the floor, cracking under his boots. He didn't stop. He diverted power to his servos, pushing through the crushing gravity with sheer mechanical torque. He backhanded the first seer, sending the figure flying across the room. "Do not kill them," Edward gritted his teeth, fighting the urge to unleash the plasma vents. "They are students. They are misguided." "They are trying to kill us," Reth shrieked, ducking behind a console, as a bolt of entropy rotted the floor where he had just been standing. "I said do not kill," Edward roared. He reached the second seer, caught the staff the cultist was wielding, and crushed it in his grip. He tossed the cultist aside gently, disarming him. Seren watched him, her eyes narrowing. "You still hold back. Even at the end you are paralyzed by your own morality. This is why you are a relic." She raised her hand. From her palm, a lance of pure veil energy, black and purple, shot toward Edward. Edward crossed his gauntlets. The beam hit his armor. The ancient metal flared white-hot. The runes on his face under the helmet began to bleed light. He skidded backward, his boots carving trenches in the stone. "You cannot fight the tide, Stitcher," Seren shouted over the roar of energy. "The anchor is breaking. The flow has begun." Above, the situation had gone from bad to catastrophic. "Hold the line!" Virginia screamed. They were being overrun. The tear in the sky had pulsed, and a massive shape was pushing through. It looked like a whale, but it swam through the air, and its skin was made of shifting mirrors. It opened a mouth that was a void of silence and sucked in the ambient mana of the academy. The student shields flickered and died. "My wand!" a student cried. "It is not working. The mana is gone." "Retreat," Virginia ordered. "Fall back to the inner sanctum." Mira stumbled. A piece of debris from a falling tower blocked her path. She scrambled over it, but her backpack snagged. "Mira!" Amelia grabbed her arm, pulling. From the shadows of the broken courtyard, a pack of the light wolves emerged. They were not mindless anymore. They sensed weakness. They circled Mira and Amelia, their jaws dripping with liquid starlight. "Dad!" Mira screamed, a reflex she couldn't stop. In the anchor chamber, Edward heard her. He didn't hear her with his ears. He heard her through the resonance. He was the Stitcher. He had bonded with the Veil 2 centuries ago. He could feel the fabric of the world tearing, and he could feel the specific, terrifying vibration of his daughter's fear. "Mira," Edward choked out. The beam from Seren was pushing him down. The anchor was cracking. If he stopped the seers, Mira would die on the surface. If he went to save Mira, the anchor would break, and everyone would die. "Choose hero," Seren taunted. "Save the world or save your heart." "You cannot do both." Edward looked up. The amber slit of his helmet burned with a cold, terrifying fury. "Watch me," he growled. Edward did the unthinkable. He disengaged the safety limiters on his armor. "Warning," the suit's AI droned. "Core temperature critical. Bio-interface limits exceeded." "Override," Edward commanded. He didn't fire back at Seren. Instead, he turned his back on her. He slammed his armored fists directly into the cracking surface of the anchor crystal. "Reth," Edward shouted. "Keep them off me for 30 seconds. "Me," Reth squealed. "Improvise." Edward closed his eyes. He didn't push energy into the crystal. He became the circuit. He opened the floodgates of his own soul, the strange, mutated biology that made him a warden. He let the energy of the anchor flow through his body, using his own nervous system as the conductive wire to bridge the crack. Pain, white, and absolute exploded in his mind. It felt like his blood had turned to molten lead. "Connect," he commanded the energy. "Stabilize." The crack in the anchor stopped spreading. The blue light of the crystal flared, turning gold, the color of Edward's aura. Serene gasped. The beam she was firing was sucked into the vortex of Edward's presence. "He is integrating with the anchor. That is suicide." "Reth," Edward roared through the pain. Reth looked around wildly. He saw the gravity grenade Edward had ignored earlier. He grabbed it with 2 hands, armed it, and rolled it like a bowling ball towards Seren and the seers. "Physics!" Reth shrieked. The grenade detonated. It didn't explode. It imploded. Seren and her cultists were yanked off their feet, pulled into a heap of tangled limbs and robes in the center of the room, pinned to the floor by 10 Gs of force. Edward had the anchor. But Mira was still in danger. He grit his teeth, blood trickling from his nose inside the helmet. He had to be in 2 places at once. He reached out with his mind, following the thread of connection he had with his daughter. He pushed his will up, through the layers of rock, through the chaos, finding her. On the surface, the light wolves lunged at Mira. Mira raised her arms, bracing for the bite. It never came. Between Mira and the wolves, the air shimmered. A figure appeared, not a physical body, but a projection of golden light. It looked like a knight in armor, but translucent and towering. The projection slammed a spectral shield into the ground. The wolves crashed against it and shattered. "Dad," Mira whispered, looking at the golden avatar. The avatar didn't speak. It simply stood there, an immovable wall between her and the monsters. It raised a hand, and a pulse of pure stability washed over the courtyard. The mirror whale in the sky shrieked as the stability wave hit it, dissolving its form into harmless rain. In the chamber below, Edward screamed. Projecting the avatar while holding the anchor was tearing him apart. The veins in his neck were glowing bright blue, visible even through the gaps in his armor. The skin was cracking light, leaking out like blood. "Warning!" the suit blared. "Cardiac arrhythmia detected. Neural cascade imminent." "Not yet," Edward gasped. He could feel the veil seers struggling against the gravity well. He could feel the anchor trying to reject him. He could feel the massive weight of the ocean of energy pressing against his mind. "Virginia!" Edward shouted over the comms channel, his voice distorted by pain. The pattern vector, Sigma 9 now. On the surface, Virginia heard him. She saw the golden avatar fading, saw the wolves regrouping. She understood. He was holding the door, but she had to turn the key. "All units," Virginia commanded, her voice breaking with emotion. "Focus on the avatar, channel your mana into the construct, feed him." "But that is raw astromancy," a student yelled. "It will burn us out. Do it," Virginia yelled. She pointed her wand at the golden figure of Edward. "Support the warden." 50 students and faculty members fired their beams of magic fire ice, kinetic wind, not at the enemy, but at the golden ghost of Edward. The avatar absorbed it all. It grew brighter, solidifying. In the depths, Edward felt the surge of power. It wasn't the cold alien power of the veil. It was warm. It was human. It was messy and chaotic, but it was alive. "Thank you," he whispered. He took that energy and shoved it into the anchor. "Close," he roared. He slammed his hands together. The anchor flashed with a blinding white light. The crack sealed with a deafening thud. A shockwave of stability blasted outward, traveling up the spire, out of the island, and into the sky. The tear in the sky zipped shut. The wind died instantly. The light creatures evaporated into mist. The mirror whale dissolved. In the anchor chamber, the machinery of the veil seers exploded in showers of sparks. The gravity well deactivated, leaving Seren and her followers groaning on the floor unconscious from the backlash. Edward let go of the crystal. He took one step back, then another. "Dad," Mira's voice came over the comms, faint and static-filled. "Dad, are you there? The ghost is gone." "I am here," Edward wheezed. His knees hit the floor. The armor felt heavy, too heavy. It felt like a coffin. "Reth," Edward whispered. Reth crawled out from behind the console, his eyes wide with terror and awe. He looked at Edward. The armor was smoking. The glowing blue veins on Edward's neck were pulsing, slowly, fading, but not disappearing. "I need a medic," Edward said. Then he fell forward face first. The sound of his helmet hitting the stone floor was the loudest sound in the sudden silence of the world. The infirmary was located in the oldest wing of the academy. It smelled of antiseptic and ancient herbs. Edward lay on a biobed, his armor stripped away. His upper body was covered in bandages, but the glowing blue lines were still visible, tracing a map of the veil across his chest and up to his jaw. Virginia sat in a chair beside the bed. She was covered in soot, her hair a disaster, but she hadn't moved for 3 hours. She held Edward's hand. His skin was cold, unnaturally so. The door hissed open. Nixari entered, followed by Mira. Mira looked small, her eyes red and puffy. "He is stable," Virginia said, quietly, not looking up. "But his bio readings are wrong. He has 50% more mana in his blood than a human should survive. He is not just a mage, Headmaster. He is a battery." Mira walked to the side of the bed. She touched her father's shoulder. Is he going to wake up? He is tough, Nixari said gently. The wardens were designed to endure the impossible. Edward stirred. His eyelids fluttered, then opened. The steel-gray eyes were hazy, but they focused on Mira. Did I pass the orientation? He rasped. Mira let out a wet laugh, tears spilling over again. You failed, Dad. You destroyed the curve for everyone. Edward tried to smile, but winced. He looked at Virginia. The Seers. In custody, Nixari answered. Seren is being held in the null cells. She is demanding to speak to you, of course. She says you cheated. I had help, Edward murmured, squeezing Virginia's hand weakly. It is not over, Edward, Nixari said, her voice turning grave. She tapped a datapad, projecting a hologram of the island's core. The oscillation was stopped, but the energy did not dissipate. It went down. She pointed to the area below the anchor. A massive, angry red sphere of energy was gathering deep in the planet's crust, directly beneath Starhaven. The anchor is sealed, Nixari said. But the pressure is building. We did not fix the pipe. We just put a cork in it. And the heart of the veil is pushing back. This was not just a raid by cultists. This was the first contraction. Edward closed his eyes. He knew what that meant. The Veil Seers were just the trigger. The real threat was the cycle itself. The universe was trying to breathe, and Starhaven was standing on its throat. The backflow, Edward whispered. It is coming. Yes, Nixari said. And when it hits a few shields and a brave warden will not be enough to stop it. We have to make a choice, Edward. We either find a way to let the pressure out, or we watch this academy burn. The room fell silent. Outside the window, the stones of the floating island gave a low, mournful groan, as if the earth itself was in pain. The battle was won, but as Edward looked at the faces of the women he had fought to protect, he knew the war had only just begun. The silence that fell over Starhaven Academy in the wake of the battle was not the peaceful silence of a library, nor the restful silence of sleep. It was the heavy, pressurized silence of a dam that was holding back too much water. Dean Reth walked through the shattered remnants of the Courtyard of Whispers. Cleanup drones buzzing like angry hornets were already at work, knitting the stone back together with beams of restructuring light. The air still smelled of ozone and the peculiar metallic tang of burnt magic. He passed a group of second-year students sitting on a makeshift bench. They should have been evacuating, or at least cowering in their dorms, but youth was a resilient and foolish thing. I heard he didn't even use a spell, a Hydran student bubbled, its liquid form rippling with excitement. I heard he just punched the ley line until it apologized. My roommate saw the armor, a Terran boy whispered, his eyes wide. He said it's older than the founding of the Federation. He said that guy is a ghost. He is not a ghost, a third student argued. He is Mira's dad, and he is terrifying. Reth hurried past, clutching his datapad to his chest. The students were treating the event like an action movie, turning Edward into a myth. They did not understand. They did not feel the subtle vibration in the floorboards that had not stopped since the battle ended. Reth felt it. His species was sensitive to tremors, and right now, Starhaven was shivering. He looked up at the veil. The tear was gone, sealed by the blinding white light of the warden's intervention, but the colors were wrong. Instead of the usual soothing aurora, the sky was a bruised, sickly yellow, pulsing with a rhythm that was too fast, like a heart in tachycardia. Myth, Reth muttered to himself, his 4 hands trembling slightly. If only he were a myth. Myths do not bleed. The medical wing of Starhaven was built inside a hollowed-out geode, the walls sparkling with amethyst crystals that naturally amplified healing spells. In the center of the private recovery room, Edward lay on a biobed that hummed with a low, soothing frequency. He was awake. He was staring at his own arm. The armor had been stripped away, piled in a heap of scorched plasteel and ceramic in the corner. For the first time, the full extent of his condition was visible. The rune scars that had previously been faint white lines on his skin were now raised angry veins of pulsing blue light. They did not look like tattoos anymore. They looked like a root system that was taking over a garden. The light pulsed in time with the yellow throbbing of the sky outside. "Stop looking at it," a voice said from the shadows. "You will make it self-conscious." Edward turned his head. Dr. Virginia Saul was sitting in a chair by the door. She looked exhausted. Her jumpsuit was still stained with soot, and her hair was a disaster of loose strands, but her eyes were sharp. She was holding a cup of lukewarm coffee, as if it were a holy relic. "It is spreading," Edward said. His voice was raspy, sounding less like gravel and more like grinding glass. "Of course it is spreading," Virginia snapped, though there was no heat in her voice. "You channeled the entire output of the anchor through a biological nervous system. You are lucky you did not simply vaporize into a cloud of angry particles. The fact that you are solid enough to complain is a medical miracle." Edward tried to sit up. His muscles screamed a deep, aching burn that went down to the bone. He grunted and fell back against the pillows. "Do not," Virginia warned, standing up and moving to the bedside. "Your cellular structure is currently arguing with itself about whether it wants to be carbon-based or ether-based. If you move too fast, you might accidentally phase your liver into the next dimension." "I have had worse," Edward muttered. "Oh, I am sure you have," Virginia said, looking down at him. Her expression softened the facade of the tough professor, cracking just enough to show the terror underneath. "But I haven't. Watching you out there, you were not fighting Edward. You were drowning." Edward looked at her. He saw the soot on her cheek, the tremor in her hand holding the coffee. He remembered the feeling of her magic, warm, chaotic human pouring into him when he was on the brink of collapse. "You saved me," he said quietly. "The Avatar construct. It would have failed without the mana feed. You rallied them." "I yelled at them," Virginia corrected. "There is a difference." She set the coffee down and sat on the edge of the bed. She hesitated, then reached out and touched the glowing blue line on his forearm. Her fingers were cool against the fever heat of his skin. "What happens next time, Edward? Because there will be a next time. The ground is still shaking." "I do not know," Edward admitted. He looked at his hand, watching the light pulse under the skin. "The veil is part of me now, or I am part of it. If I use this power again, I might not come back. I might just become weather." "Don't," Virginia whispered. She gripped his hand tight. "Do not say that. You are a person. You are a father. You are interesting to talk to." "Interesting," Edward raised an eyebrow, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "That is the best you can do. I stopped an interdimensional invasion, and I am interesting." "You are infuriating," Virginia countered, blinking back a sudden shine of tears. "You are reckless. You are a tank with a martyr complex. And," she took a breath, looking him dead in the eye, "and if you dissolve into the sky, I will be very, very angry with you." The air in the room grew heavy, charged with something that wasn't magic. It was the terrified intimacy of two soldiers who had survived a mortar shell and realized they might not survive the next one. "I will try to stay solid," Edward promised softly. "Try harder," Virginia said. The door hissed open. Headmaster Nixari stood there. She was back in her formal robes, but she looked older than she had that morning. Her ears were flat against her skull. "I am sorry to interrupt," Nixari said, her voice devoid of its usual purr. "But the council is gathered, and we need the truth, all of it." She looked at Edward, then at Virginia. "Bring Mira," Nixari added. Edward stiffened. "No, she stays out of this." "She is already in it, Edward," Nixari said firmly. "She saw you turn into a golden titan. She saw you nearly die. If you try to shut her out now, you will lose her faster than the veil can take you. She has a right to know what her father really is." Edward looked at Virginia. Virginia nodded slowly. "She is right," Virginia said. "She is not a child anymore. You cannot protect her with silence." The council chamber was located in the Spire of Silence, a room soundproofed by layers of vacuum. A large, circular table made of floating obsidian shards dominated the room. Around the table sat the core faculty of Starhaven Nixari, Dean Reth, who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else, a massive rock-skinned geology professor, and an ethereal being of pure light who taught history. Edward sat at one end wearing a spare tunic that Virginia had found for him. It was too tight across the shoulders. Mira sat next to him. She was pale, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, staring at the table. She hadn't looked at Edward since they entered. "We do not have time for pleasantries." Nixari began standing at the head of the table. She waved her hand, and a hologram of the island chain appeared in the center. "The structural integrity of Starhaven is at 40%. The oscillation we experienced today was not an attack by the Veil Seers. They merely poked a sleeping dragon." Nixari manipulated the hologram, stripping away the layers of rock and soil until only the core of the main island remained. There, pulsing with a terrifying rhythmic red light, was a sphere of energy. It looked like a star trapped in a cage. "This," Nixari said, pointing to the sphere, "is the heart of the Veil. It is the single largest convergence point of dimensional tiers in the galaxy. Starhaven Academy was not built here to study the Veil. It was built here to sit on top of it. We are the lid on the pressure cooker." A murmur went around the table. "And 500 years ago," Nixari continued, turning her golden eyes to Edward, "the lid almost blew off. The Great Collapse. The history books say a coalition of archmages performed a ritual to seal it. That is a lie." She paused. "It was not a coalition. It was one man, one warden." Mira's head snapped up. She looked at her father. "Edward," Nixari said, "is not just a soldier. He is the keystone. The ritual did not just use a spell. It used a living vessel. He took the chaotic energy of the heart and bound it to his own biorhythm. He physically stitched the tear with his own life force." The silence in the room was absolute. "You," Mira's voice was a whisper, trembling. "You are the seal." Edward stared at the obsidian table. "Yes. So when you said you were working in the garage all those years," Mira said, her voice rising, cracking with emotion. "When you said you were tired, it was because you were holding the planet together. Physically." "I was dormant," Edward said, his voice low. "The bond was passive, but yes. The weight was always there." Mira stood up. Her chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Why didn't you tell me?" she demanded. Tears were streaming down her face, hot and angry. "My whole life I thought you were just sad. I thought you were just a broken veteran who couldn't handle the real world. I treated you like you were fragile. I felt guilty for leaving you." She slammed her hand on the table. "I felt guilty for wanting to live my life because I thought I was leaving my poor lonely dad behind." Mira sobbed. "But you weren't lonely. You were Atlas. You were carrying the sky, and you let me think you were just fixing toasters. I wanted you to have a childhood." Edward shouted back, standing up. The blue veins on his neck flared. "If you knew, you would have been afraid every single day. You would have watched the sky wondering if today was the day your father exploded." "I would have known you were a hero," Mira screamed. "I would have been proud instead of ashamed." The word hung in the air like a slap. Edward recoiled, as if he had been physically struck. Mira covered her mouth, her eyes wide with instant regret. "Dad, I didn't mean—" "No," Edward said, sinking back into his chair. He looked suddenly very old. "You are right. I gave you a father who was a recluse, a weirdo in armor. I thought ignorance was safety. I was wrong." Virginia watched them, her heart breaking. She looked at Edward, the man she was falling for, and saw the terrifying truth. He wasn't just a man. He was a component, a fuse, and fuses were designed to burn out. "So," Virginia said, her voice steady, despite the shaking of her hands, If the heart is waking up, what happens to the keystone? Nexari hesitated. She looked at the hologram. The seal is 200 years old, Nexari said softly. It is degrading. The Veil Seers proved that today. The heart is rejecting the stitches. If we do nothing, the pressure will build until the island and likely the hemisphere is vaporized. So we reinforce it, the geology professor rumbled. We cannot, Nexari said. Not with stone. Not with spells. She looked at Edward. The only way to stop the explosion is to renew the seal, to rebind the keystone. Renew it, Virginia asked sharply. What does that entail? Edward must go into the heart, Nexari said. And he must merge with it completely. He must cease to be a biological entity and become a permanent, metaphysical lock. You mean he has to die, Virginia said. Her voice was ice cold. Not die, Nexari corrected. Transcend. He would become the consciousness of the barrier. He would be everywhere. But he wouldn't be here, Mira whispered. He wouldn't be my dad anymore. He would be the shield that keeps you alive, Nexari said gently. It is the only way guaranteed to work. It is the choice he made centuries ago. It is the duty of a warden. It is human sacrifice, Virginia slammed her fist on the table. You are talking about sacrificing a sentient being to plug a hole that is barbaric. We are scientists. We are mages. We find solutions. We do not throw virgins into volcanoes. Do you have a better idea, Dr. Saul? Nexari snapped, her patience fraying. Because right now, the readings show we have less than 12 hours before the next contraction. And that one will be the last. I might, a new voice said. Everyone turned. Reth was standing by the door, holding a data pad. He looked terrified to be speaking, but he stepped forward. I was monitoring the prisoner, Reth stammered. Seren. She has been reviewing the data from the battle. She says we are looking at it wrong. Seren is a terrorist, the history professor scoffed. Seren is a genius who almost broke the world, Virginia said. If she has a theory, I want to hear it. The holding cells were stark, white boxes of null magic fields. Seren sat on the floor, her white fur looking gray in the harsh light. When Edward, Virginia, and Nexari entered, she didn't look up. She was tracing formulas on the floor with her claw. You are here to ask me how to fix the mess I made, Seren said. We are here to ask if you want to live, Edward said. He stood by the barrier, his arms crossed. Because if the heart breaches your cell, vaporizes first. Seren looked up, her black eyes fixed on Edward's glowing runes. You look terrible, Stitcher, she said, with a humorless smile. The energy is eating you. You are trying to hold back the ocean with a sponge. Nexari says the only way is to merge, Virginia said, stepping forward. To reseal the lock, Seren laughed. It was a sharp, barking sound. Of course the cat thinks that. Status quo, stasis, safety. She stood up and walked to the barrier. If you merge him, you will buy another 200 years. Maybe. But the pressure will keep building. And the next time it breaks, there won't be a warden strong enough to stop it. You are just kicking the apocalypse down the road. What is the alternative? Edward asked. Stop trying to be a wall, Seren said. The veil wants to flow. It is information. It is energy. You are trying to dam a river. What happens when you dam a river floods? She pointed a claw at Edward. Build a canal, she said. A canal, Virginia frowned. A bridge, Seren clarified. Instead of locking the heart, you reconfigure it. You use the warden not as a cork, but as a filter. You let the energy flow through, but you strip out the destructive resonance. You allow the connection between worlds, but on safe terms. You don't block the veil. You tame it. That is impossible, Nexari said. The amount of processing power required to filter the heart, no mind can handle that. Even a warden would burn out in seconds. One mind, yes, Seren said. One mind would burn. But what if he wasn't alone? She looked at Virginia. Then, She looked at the door where Mira was waiting. The Stitcher failed because he was solitary, Seren said. He bore the weight alone. That is the flaw of your philosophy, Warden. You think sacrifice is a solo act. But if you want to build a bridge, you need anchors on both sides. Edward stared at her. The idea was radical. It was dangerous. It went against every protocol of the Warden Corps. But as he felt the burning pressure in his veins, he knew she was right. It requires a network, Virginia said, her mind racing. A psychic lattice. If Edward is the central processor, we can use the ley lines of the Academy to offload the stress. We can share the load. Risky, Nixari said, her tail twitching. If the lattice fails, everyone linked to it dies. Not just Edward. We are all dead anyway if we don't try, Virginia argued. She turned to Edward. It is a chance to solve it permanently, a chance for you to stay you. Edward looked at the floor. He felt the weight of the armor he wasn't wearing. He felt the fear of the little girl he had raised. He felt the warmth of Virginia's hand. I have to think, Edward said. The night air on the roof of the observation tower was cold and biting. The wind howled around the spire, carrying the scent of impending storm. Edward stood at the edge, looking down at the swirling abyss of the veil. It was angry tonight. The colors were violent clashes of crimson and sickly green. He heard the door open. He didn't turn. I told you to stay inside, Edward said. You tell me to do a lot of things, Mira said. She walked up to the railing and stood beside him. She was wearing a thick coat, huddled against the cold. I am sorry, Edward said after a long silence. About the secrets, about the lies. I know, Mira said. She didn't look at him. She looked at the chaotic sky. I was mad, really mad. But then I thought about the time I was 7 and I scraped my knee and you built me a leg brace out of titanium because you were afraid I'd break a bone. Edward chuckled a dry sound. It was carbon fiber. Titanium is too heavy for a 7-year-old. You are ridiculous, Mira said, smiling slightly. Then her face fell. Dad, Nixari wants you to die. Nixari wants to save the school, Edward said. It is a math equation to her. One life for thousands. And what is it to you? Mira asked. She turned to face him. Is it math or is it just habit? Are you so used to throwing yourself on the grenade that you don't know how to do anything else? Edward sighed. He looked at his hands. The blue light was pulsing faster now. I am tired, Mira. I have been fighting this war since before your grandfather was born. Part of me wants to just close my eyes and let the current take me. It would be peaceful. No more pain. No more fear. And no more me, Mira whispered. Edward flinched. He looked at her. Her eyes were fierce, burning with a strength he hadn't realized she possessed. If you give up, Mira said, her voice shaking but hard. If you choose the easy way out because you are tired, I will never forgive you. You don't get to quit. You are my dad. That is a lifetime appointment. The bridge idea, Edward said. It is dangerous. If I try to filter the heart and I fail, the backlash could kill you. It could kill Virginia. It could kill everyone on this rock. We are willing to take that risk, Mira said. Are you? Edward looked at the veil. He saw the chaos. But for the first time, he didn't just see a monster to be caged. He saw potential. He saw the future. Seren had talked about a world where the unknown wasn't feared, but understood. He looked at Mira. She wasn't a child to be protected anymore. She was a partner. I am scared, Edward admitted. It was the first time he had said those words aloud in 200 years. Good, Mira said. She reached out and took his glowing hand. Fear keeps you sharp. That is what you taught me. If we do this, Edward said, gripping her hand, we do it together. No more secrets. No more hiding. Deal, Mira said. The door opened again. Virginia and Nixari stepped out. Reth was peeking out from behind them, looking like he expected the roof to blow off. "The contraction is starting," Virginia said, urgency in her voice. "The readings are spiking. If we are going to do this, we have to do it now." Edward nodded. He looked at Nixari. "We are not doing the seal," Edward said. "We are building the bridge." Nixari stared at him for a long moment. Then slowly she nodded. "Then, may the ancestors forgive us if we are wrong. We need to go to the heart." The descent to the heart of the Veil was a journey into the bowels of the planet. They took a service elevator that hadn't been used in centuries, rattling down a shaft that seemed to have no bottom. Inside the cage were Edward, Virginia, Mira, and Nixari. Reth stayed at the controls on the surface, his voice crackling over the intercom. "Students are in the bunkers," Reth reported, his voice surprisingly steady. "I have told them that we are conducting a grand experiment. They are watching the monitors. The whole school is watching." "No pressure," Virginia muttered, checking the charge on her wand. As they descended, the air grew hot. The walls of the shaft changed from stone to a strange organic metal that pulsed with light. Edward stood in the center of the elevator. He had donned his armor again, but without the helmet. The chest plate was open, revealing the undersuit and the blazing network of veins on his neck. He looked at Virginia. "If I start to burn out," Edward said to her, "cut the link. Save yourself." "Shut up, Edward," Virginia said, checking the straps on his pauldrons. "I am the professor of logistics. I do not cut links. I reinforce them." She looked up at him, and for a moment, the professional mask slipped completely. She reached up and touched his cheek, her thumb brushing a glowing rune. "Come back to me," she whispered. "I have not figured out your entire mystery yet. I hate leaving puzzles unfinished." "I will try," Edward said. The elevator shuddered to a halt. The massive blast doors in front of them groaned. "We are here," Nixari said. "The heart chamber." She placed her hand on the verification panel. "This is it," Mira said, taking a deep breath. She stood next to her father, her shoulder touching his armored arm. The doors hissed open. Blinding, absolute light spilled out. It wasn't just light. It was a physical force, a wind of pure brilliance that made them squint and shield their eyes. Before them lay a cavern the size of a city, and in the center, suspending in a web of lightning and reality shards, was the heart. It was a swirling vortex of every color imaginable, a hurricane of raw creation and destruction. "Okay," Edward said, stepping into the light. The servos of his armor whined as they fought the magnetic pressure. "Let's go to work." He walked forward, not as a lonely sentinel this time, but as the vanguard of a team. Behind him, the three women stepped into the glare, ready to rewrite the laws of their universe. The blast doors hissed shut behind them, sealing away the elevator shaft and the rest of reality. Edward, Virginia, Mira, and Headmaster Nixari stood on the precipice of the unknown. The heart chamber was not a room in any architectural sense. It was a hollowed-out sphere inside the planet's crust, vast enough to swallow the entire academy. There was no floor, only a suspended walkway of ancient, translucent crystal that led toward the center. And in the center, there was the storm. It was a swirling hurricane of light, aurora borealis condensed into a physical mass, writhing in colors that the human eye struggled to process. It was beautiful, terrifying, and deafeningly silent. At the very eye of this storm stood a jagged, broken pillar of obsidian. It looked like a fractured bone protruding from the universe itself. "The old anchor," Nixari whispered, her voice amplified by the strange acoustics of the chamber. "The place where the stitch was made." Edward walked forward. His heavy boots made no sound on the crystal walkway. He had removed his helmet, clipping it to his belt. His face was pale, the glowing blue veins pulsating in a frantic rhythm that matched the swirling lights of the storm. "It remembers me," Edward said. His voice was not fearful but resigned. "I can feel it pulling at the seams of my soul." Mira walked beside him, her hand gripping the edge of his chest plate. "It feels angry," she murmured. "Not angry," Edward corrected gently. "Hungry. It wants to be whole. It wants to flow." They reached the central platform. The broken obsidian pillar hummed with a low, painful vibration. It was cracked down the middle, and from the fracture raw white light was bleeding out. "This is where it ends," Edward said. He looked at the pillar, then at his hands. "Or where it begins." He reached out and placed his bare palm against the cold, jagged stone of the pillar. The reaction was instantaneous. The room didn't explode. Instead, it vanished. For a moment there was no chamber, no academy, no planet. There was only memory. The memories hit Virginia Mira and Nixari with the force of a physical blow. Because they were standing in the splash zone of a connection between a warden and the heart, they were dragged into the slipstream of Edward's mind. They saw the past. They saw a battlefield from 2 centuries ago. The sky was burning. A young man, Edward, but with smoother skin and eyes that hadn't yet turned to steel, stood alone on a mountain peak. He wasn't wearing armor. He was wearing tattered robes. He was screaming, not in pain, but in incantation. "I am the wall, the memory," Edward roared. "I am the gate, I bind this wound with my own substance." The viewers saw the truth that Edward had hidden, even from himself. He didn't just cast a spell. He reached into his own chest, pulled out a piece of his glowing, incandescent spirit, and slammed it into the rift. The rift didn't just close. It merged with him. The scene shifted. It was a medical bay, clinical and cold. Doctors were hovering over a body, Edward's body. "He is not human anymore," a surgeon was saying, his voice trembling. "Look at the cellular decay. His DNA is being rewritten by etheric radiation. He is a living warden. He is half man, half membrane." Mira gasped in the vision. She watched as they encased the coma-stricken Edward in the first version of his armor, not to protect him from the world, but to hold his unstable body together, to keep him from dissolving into pure energy. The memory shifted again. A different planet. A jungle world burning with purple fire. A species of feline humanoids, the Falari, were running screaming as the veil tore open above their cities. A silver comet slammed into the ground between the refugees and the wave of destruction. It was Edward in an earlier version of his armor. He didn't fight the wave. He opened his arms. He absorbed it. He stood there, a lightning rod for the apocalypse, letting the chaotic energy flow through his body, filtering it, taking the poison into his own veins so the Falari could escape. In the crowd of fleeing refugees, a small Falari child with wide, terrified golden eyes stopped. She looked at the metal giant who was burning alive to save them. She didn't run. She bowed. A clumsy child's bow, but filled with absolute awe. The memory faded, snapping back to the present. Nixari was on her knees on the crystal platform. Tears were streaming down her furred face. "I saw you," Nixari whispered, looking up at Edward. "I was 5 years old. You took the fire of Cathara into your own body. You burned for 3 days so my transport could launch." Edward looked down at her. "I remember," he said softly. "You had a stuffed toy, a blue lizard." Nixari let out a sob that was half laugh. "You remember the lizard? You saved a civilization and you remember my lizard." "It looked important to you," Edward shrugged. Virginia wiped her eyes. She looked at Edward with a new, terrifying understanding. "You are the Warden Vitae," she said, using the ancient term. "The living warden. You are not a mage. You are a biological partition. That is why you have lived so long. That is why the armor is part of you." "And that is why I have to do this alone," Edward said. He stepped closer to the pillar. "If I merge with the heart, I can stabilize the core. I become the permanent lock. The pressure stops." "And you cease to exist," Mira said. Her voice was trembling, but her eyes were dry. "You become a ghost in the machine." I become the machine, Edward corrected. It is the only way to be sure. No, a voice crackled over the comms. It was Seren. Nixari tapped her wrist unit, projecting a hologram of the Falari scientist from her cell. Seren looked tired, but her eyes were sharp. The Stitcher is trying to be a martyr again, Seren scoffed. Typical. You humans are so obsessed with tragic endings. Do you have a better idea, prisoner? Edward growled. We are running out of time. The pressure is at 90%. I told you, Seren said. Do not be a wall. Be a bridge. You are a living warden. You are compatible with both biology and energy. Do not close the door. Open it, but put a filter on it. A filter? Edward asked. Reweave the heart, Seren explained, her hands moving rapidly as she manipulated a data model on her end. Instead of a hard seal, create a semi-permeable membrane. Let the knowledge through. Let the communication signals through. But block the chaotic matter. Transform the anchor from a plug into a prism. That requires a level of control I do not have, Edward argued. The energy will rip my mind apart before I can weave the pattern. That is why you do not do it alone, Virginia stepped forward. She placed her hand on his left shoulder. You are the processor, Edward. We are the heat sinks. We are the grounding wires. No, Edward shook his head violently. I will not risk you. If the backlash hits it, we'll fry your nervous systems. You will be vegetables. We know the risks, Mira said, stepping to his right side and grabbing his hand. And we are doing it anyway. Mira, you are 18 years old, Edward shouted. You are supposed to be worrying about grades and boys, not metaphysical implosion. I am the daughter of the warden, Mira shouted back. And I am studying astromancy. I know the math, Dad. A closed system builds entropy until it explodes. An open system survives. If you lock this door again, you are just condemning the next generation to deal with the explosion. Let's fix it for real this time. Edward looked at her. He saw the fire in her eyes, the same fire he had felt in himself 200 years ago. But she had something he never did. She had faith that the universe didn't have to be an enemy. He looked at Virginia. I am not leaving, Virginia said simply. You tried the lone wolf strategy for 2 centuries. Look where it got you. Alone in a garage. Try something new, Edward. Try trusting someone. Edward looked at the swirling chaos of the heart. He felt the terrifying pull of the energy. But for the first time, the pull didn't feel like death. It felt like invitation. Nixari, Edward asked. I am ready, the headmaster said. She stood at the edge of the platform, her hands glowing with the light of the master runes. I have established a link with Dean Reth in the control tower and Seren in the lab. We are the lattice. You are the focal point. Edward took a deep breath. It sounded like a rattle in his chest. Okay, he whispered. Let's weave a new world. He stepped into the fracture of the obsidian pillar. The pain was not like fire. It was like being unmade. As Edward entered the energy stream, his armor didn't melt. It deconstructed. The heavy plasteel plates unlocked and floated away from his body, suspended in the anti-gravity of the ritual. Underneath, his body was glowing so brightly that his bones were visible as dark shadows. Virginia, Mira, now, Edward screamed, as the first wave of the veil hit his mind. Virginia and Mira did not let go. They gripped his hands tighter. Anchor established, Virginia yelled, squeezing her eyes shut. She poured her own magic, her own will into Edward. She wasn't trying to control the veil. She was trying to hold Edward together. I am here, she projected into his mind. You are Edward. You drink coffee. You hate paperwork. You are real. Pattern initiated, Mira shouted. She used her training visualizing the complex geometry of the filter Seren had designed. She fed the equations into her father's mind, giving him the blueprint he needed. Dad, focus on the weave. Over under pull, Edward gasped. The energy of the heart roared through him. It was a billion voices screaming at once. It was the history of dead stars. It was the future of unborn galaxies. It tried to wash him away. It tried to tell him that Edward was a small, insignificant concept. Let go, the veil whispered. Become the ocean. His vision blurred. He couldn't feel his hands. He couldn't remember his name. Who am I, he thought. I am the wall. The voice was small, but it cut through the roar of the universe like a diamond. You are the guy who tied my shoes in front of the headmaster. A memory flashed in the chaos. A little girl with a scraped knee. A teenager embarrassed at a bus stop. A young woman standing in a council room demanding the truth. Mira. Another voice joined in. Warm, sarcastic. You are the idiot who tried to impress me by grooming a singularity. A memory of lukewarm tea on a cold roof. A touch on a scarred cheek. Virginia. Edward's soul grabbed onto those voices. They were anchors. They were unbreakable. I am not a wall, Edward realized. I am a warden. And a warden does not just block. A warden protects. He opened his eyes that were now blazing with pure white starlight. He reached out with his mind and grabbed the chaotic strands of the veil. He didn't fight them. He guided them. Come, he commanded the energy. Do not break. Flow. He began to weave. Using the floating plates of his armor as needles, he spun the energy of the heart into a new pattern. He took the jagged, angry red lines of destruction and twisted them, braided them with the stability of the earth and the logic of the mind. The color of the storm began to change. The sickly yellow and angry violet bled away. In their place, a deep, rich indigo appeared threaded with veins of gold. It is working! Nixari shouted from the perimeter. The pressure is dropping, the waveform is harmonizing. But the heart did not want to be tamed easily. A final surge of resistance kicked back. A massive pulse of raw power slammed into Edward. Dad! Mira screamed as she felt his grip loosen. Edward was being pulled backward toward the event horizon of the rift. His body was becoming translucent. I cannot hold it, Edward gasped. It is too heavy. You are not holding it alone, Virginia yelled. She looked at Nixari. Connect the school, connect everyone. Nixari didn't hesitate. Dean Reth, activate the campus-wide link now. On the surface, Reth threw a lever. Every runestone on Starhaven Academy flared to life. Every student huddled in the bunkers felt a sudden tingle in their minds. They didn't know the technical details, but they felt the intent. Help him. 300 young minds full of hope, fear, and imagination poured their energy into the ley lines. The energy rushed down the shaft into the chamber and hit Edward like a tidal wave of support. It wasn't just raw power. It was belief. Edward felt it. He felt the students. He felt the hope of the future. He roared. It was a sound of triumph. He grabbed the two edges of the reality tear. He didn't pull them shut. He wove them together into a lattice, a beautiful, intricate stained glass window of energy. It is done, Edward shouted. He released the energy. The storm shattered. The silence that followed was instant and absolute. The swirling hurricane was gone. In the center of the chamber, the obsidian pillar was no longer broken. It had been transformed. It was now a pillar of clear, diamond-like crystal, pulsing with a gentle, rhythmic golden light. Edward fell. Dad! Mira scrambled forward, catching him before he hit the ground. Virginia was there a second later, her hands frantically checking his pulse. Edward, Virginia whispered. Edward, breathe. For a long, terrifying minute he didn't move. His skin was gray. The blue veins were gone, leaving only faint white scars. Then he gasped. A deep, ragged intake of air. He opened his eyes. They were gray again. Just gray. Did we? Edward wheezed. Did we pass the final exam? Mira burst into tears, burying her face in his neck. You jerk. You absolute jerk, you scared me. Edward raised a hand to pat her back. His hand was trembling, but it was solid. "I am solid," Edward marveled, looking at his fingers. "I am just me." Virginia let out a shaky laugh, slumping back onto the crystal floor. "You are just you. But look at your clothes." Edward looked down. His armor was gone. The heavy, scarred plasteel had been consumed in the ritual. In its place, draped over his tunic, was a cloak. But it wasn't made of fabric. It was woven from the light of the veil itself, shimmering semi-solid shifting colors, like a calm ocean. "The armor didn't disappear," Nixari said, walking toward them, looking awestruck. "It evolved. You are no longer encased in metal, Edward. You are clothed in the veil." Edward touched the cloak. It felt warm. It felt like home. "I am not the lock anymore," Edward realized. He looked at the gentle pulsing of the crystal pillar. "I am just the gardener." On the surface, the world had changed. The students emerged from the bunkers to see a sky they didn't recognize. The threatening, sickly barrier was gone. In its place was a magnificent web of light, a translucent aurora that spanned the heavens. It didn't look like a wall keeping them in. It looked like a window looking out. Through the new veil, they could see faint stars from other dimensions. They could hear whisperings of knowledge clear and uncorrupted by chaos. In the detention block, Seren looked out the window of her cell. She watched the golden lattice in the sky. She nodded slowly. "Not bad, Stitcher," she whispered. "Not bad at all." Epilogue. 6 weeks later, the morning sun hit the white spires of Starhaven Academy, making them gleam. The air was filled with the sound of laughter footsteps and the occasional explosion of a failed chemistry spell. It was the first day of the new term. In the Great Hall, the entire student body was gathered. The mood was electric. Headmaster Nixari stood at the podium. She looked regal, her fur groomed to perfection. "Welcome back," she purred into the microphone. "We have had an eventful summer, but Starhaven stands, and it stands stronger than before." She gestured to the side of the stage. "I am pleased to announce the formation of our new Department of Veil Integration," Nixari said, led by Professor Virginia Saul. Virginia stepped forward, wearing crisp, new academic robes. She smiled at the students, looking confident and radiant. "And," Nixari continued, a mischievous glint in her eye, "we have a new member of the administration. Please welcome the Guardian of the Anchor and our new Dean of Campus Safety, Mr. Edward." Edward walked onto the stage. He wasn't wearing tank-like battle armor. He was wearing a simple dark suit, but over his shoulders hung the shimmering cloak of veil light. It flowed around him like water, commanding instant respect. The students cheered. It was a deafening roar. They stomped their feet. "That's my dad," Mira yelled from the front row, standing up and waving. She didn't look embarrassed. She looked like she was ready to fight anyone who didn't clap loud enough. Edward stood at the podium. He looked at the sea of alien and human faces. He looked at Mira, beaming with pride. He looked at Virginia, who was looking at him with an expression that promised a very interesting dinner conversation later. He cleared his throat. "Please keep off the grass," Edward said into the microphone. "And no unauthorized dimensional portals in the dorms. I will know." The students laughed. Nixari stepped forward. And there, in front of the entire school, she bowed to him again. It wasn't the fearful bow of a child in a war zone, or the secret bow of an orientation day. It was a bow of partnership, of equality. Edward returned the bow stiffly, but sincerely. As the assembly dispersed, Edward and Virginia walked out onto the balcony overlooking the new, peaceful veil. "So," Virginia said, leaning against the railing. "Dean of Safety, you know that involves paperwork, right?" "I have a plan for that," Edward said. "I am going to delegate it to Reth." "Poor Reth," Virginia laughed. She turned to him. The wind caught the edges of his light cloak, making it dance. "You look good, Edward," she said softly. "You look light." "I feel light," Edward admitted. He looked at her. For the first time in 200 years, I don't feel like I'm waiting for the sky to fall. That is because you are holding it up, Virginia said. But you are not doing it alone. Edward reached out and took her hand. No, I am not. He leaned in. Virginia didn't pull away. She leaned up, meeting him halfway. The kiss was gentle, warm, and tasted of new beginnings. It wasn't the desperate kiss of a movie climax. It was the steady, promising kiss of a future that had finally arrived. Above them, the veil shimmered with a soft, approving gold, and the floating islands of Starhaven drifted peacefully in the morning light, safe, sound, and open to the wonders of the universe.